We're going to be dealing this morning with two very different kinds of evidence. And this is a lecture that is written for an informed audience. Many of you I know are docents. Many of you have a Chinese or Japanese or Korean chronology in your head. So if I start with a sentence like we have two very different kinds of evidence, I hope people are nodding and saying, okay, now I'm ready to go. Mainly, we have physical evidence. And if you've read a book about Chinese architecture that is not recent, or if you took a course on Chinese architecture a few decades ago, there wasn't very much above ground. The other kind of evidence that we're dealing with is right on the ground or underground. And so what I hope that we do today, what I hope I'm able to do, is show you some buildings that you haven't seen before. My map of East Asia, and I will talk about East Asia as East Asia. China, Korea, Japan, Mongolia, Vietnam doesn't really kick into this narrative in a productive way for our purposes today, but that's the fifth of the 5 countries that the National Research Council defines as East Asia. My map of East Asia might be a little bit different from yours. China, of course, is dominant. But Mongolia is there, and Russia is there too. And that's why we are looking at this map, because the eastern half of the Asian continent includes a lot of what is today Russia. Borders change and people move, and Asia is a continent of migration and transmigration. And what we are going to talk about today, and what I'm going to try to do today, is choose topics that are East Asian driven, even though China is the core, not just of what I do, but the core of architecture. So I was asked to give a study guide, and a full page of it is just a list of dynasties and time periods. And that's not all of them, but that's what the period that we are dealing with today involves. From the year 220, when the Han Dynasty falls, until 580s, when China reunites, more than 30 polities rise and fall. Some of them, many of them simultaneously. And so they're all listed on your map, on your first page. So in brief, China divides into 3 kingdoms. And this is followed by the period known as the 16 states or the 16 kingdoms, only in the north. And all the rulers are non-Chinese, and it endures until the 430s. 439 is when the last of the non-Chinese dynasties or states falls. You will not count 16 here, because they rise and fall on top of each other. Some of them only endure for 15 or 20 years and leave a very small footprint on the landscape. But I'll show you some of what they've left today. The dynasty that you probably know, Northern Wei, emerges. It actually emerges in 398, which is earlier than the date that you might have, and depends on what book you're reading. Emerges in southern Mongolia. It establishes a capital in the 5th century in the city of Datong, and then the famous Northern Wei capital in Luoyang falls in 494, and that we will look at some remains from Luoyang during this period. Then the Northern Wei splits into Eastern and Western, and there is a period when it looks like the South, which has been native Chinese all along. This is the area, the map lower right, Liang Dynasty, that we will talk about early on in the lecture. There's a period when it looks like it will overtake China and China will reunite again, but that's not what happens. The dynasty called Northern Zhou, whose ancestry is not Chinese, that's your map on the left, rises, and it's out of that dynasty that the person who unifies China in the 580s emerges. And then we have the glorious, approximately nearly 300 years of Tang Dynasty, following a short reign of Sui, and this is the period when the borders of China actually touch the borders of West Asia. Through all this, The history of Chinese architecture for centuries has been written based on two standing pagodas. And what you see right here is one of those pagodas. It was largely untouched until the picture that I am about to show you from the year 523, when it was patronized by an Empress Dowager in the city of Luoyang. This is about 75 kilometers from Luoyang. It is monumental, that is, it's large and tall, and it is 12-sided. It's the only 12-sided monument that stands anywhere in East Asia. I interpret it as Chinese attempting to make a circle, but within the Chinese building system of brick. So the closest that someone could come in 523 is a dodecagon. So on the right, you see the dodecagon in a form that I never saw. The first time I tried to see this, I was in a bus accident. The second time I tried to see this, it was under scaffolding. And what you are looking at on the left is, by all admissions, including Central Bureau in Beijing, one of the real disasters of historic preservation in China. The pagoda at Songyuan Monastery is completely refaced. This is my own picture of when I finally got there in the 21st century. And so you have to look at old pictures to see what it looked like. Why would it be circular? It's a pagoda. This is the Chinese version of the Indian stupa, the relic mound under which the ashes or the cremated remains of the historical Buddha and others should have been buried. In his case, the remains were circulated, but this is a sign of the Buddha and also a sign of Buddha's death. It joins the pagoda on the right. It's called the Four Entry, the Suman Pagoda, in Shandong. It's in Shandong Province. There's a mistake in my PowerPoint, but it should be correct on your study guide. It's in Shandong Province and roughly contemporary. It was founded by a monk in the 460s. It's rebuilt, and inscription dates it to early in the 600s. What you're looking at is that the Chinese have not yet resolved what a pagoda is supposed to look like. There is a building system in China that is four-sided. Buildings take the shape of rectangles, if not squares, and the pagoda is an outlier. And even though we will only look at a few pagodas in this lecture, as a general point, the pagoda is the feature that moves in a monastery. There can be one, there can be two, it can be in its own precinct, there can be 0 pagodas in a monastery. It's always a sign that Buddhism came to China from afar. It is not a native Chinese religion, and the Chinese never quite figured out what to do with it. I add a third pagoda. You have some pieces from the exterior face of this pagoda in the museum, Shouding Monastery Pagoda in northern Henan Province, that has a date of around the 6th century, but was restored. But I show it to you so that we can look at this map, and even though you are looking at 3 buildings that look fairly close to each other on the map, they're part of 3 different political spheres. This is the other possible explanation for why the pagodas don't look alike. What survives doesn't fit into neat packages where we can say this begins here and goes here and then goes here. But simultaneously, under different rulers during this period before unification in the Tang or Sui Tang period, buildings can be very close to each other and not look very alike, and we don't even assume that the people who worshipped at one pagoda worshipped at the other one. So that's the reason that, and then we can add to this 2 other pagodas that you see only in reconstruction drawings. We'll look at these again at the bottom. In the city of Luoyang, from the year 516, there is a building foundation of a 4-sided pagoda, but it is not the pagoda that you see on the right or left. It's multi-story. The builders want this pagoda to soar because it is going to stand out on the landscape as a clear sign of Buddhism. You have to get close to the two pagodas on the right to interact with them, to worship the Buddha, even if you don't enter it. More than two reconstruction drawings of what a four-sided pagoda would have looked like at this time. This is the reason that for decades, people have also always turned to Japan. The 22 oldest wooden buildings that survive in Asia, not just East Asia, Asia, probably the world, but I'm not positive, and it depends how high something has to be to put it in the category that you're looking at here. 22 oldest wooden buildings in East Asia are in Japan, and these are they, and it is not until the year 782 that the first building survives from China, and that is followed by these two buildings from the 9th century. The one on the left is undated, but it's first half of the 9th century. And the oldest wooden architecture in Korea is what you see right here, 14th and 15th century buildings. So these are Yuan period buildings as far as I'm concerned, Mongol period and later. So we won't look at any wooden architecture from Korea today, but you may be surprised how much Korea informs us about the picture in East Asia. So where do the buildings that I just showed you and where do the four-sided pagodas come from? One of the oldest theories, which is still accepted, is that the Chinese indeed like to build four-sided architecture, and the only tall building in China, when the pagoda finally makes its way to the eastern side of China, is the four-sided gate tower or pillar tower. Sometimes they can be what are called the mother-child, that is the taller side and the lower side. These that you see here survive, my picture on the left, an old picture on the right, from the early 3rd century, very late Han Dynasty. Another source, and we will be looking at some architecture before the 5th century because nothing begins from nothing, and our 5th century builders certainly saw other kinds of architecture that informed them how to construct. Another part of the package before the 5th century in China are funerary objects. You will never hear me call these models. There is no evidence anywhere that these were modeled after buildings. These are funerary objects that go into a tomb because there needs to be architecture in the tomb. But probably there was no tower that had the kind of leaves that you see on the right anywhere in China in the 2nd century. However, the details are extremely important. And if you look at the slide on the lower left, you will see a very specific roof tile that probably tells us very specifically what roof tiles look like. People go into tombs to find out about Chinese architecture before the 5th century. On the left, I'm inside a tomb from the 170s in southern Inner Mongolia, but it was part of the Han Dynasty at that time. It's a military town or a garrison, and the builder put very complicated bracket sets on top of the pillars to support the roof, all in paint, of course. On the right, from the 1st or 2nd century CE, a picture that you find in books since the 1930s, relief sculpture inside a tomb with two of the gate towers that you're seeing and that we've just seen in full size. And if you're wondering about the bird and you know what the 4 directional animals are, this is a red bird, and this tells us that the tower should have been in the south. The next period, 3rd century, from which architecture survives in China, that is freestanding architecture, takes us to the deserts of southern Xinjiang. So we are in what's called the Shanshan region. I'm in Miran, but I could be in Lolan or Endera or Ruwak. We are looking at mud earth pagodas that are crosses between four-sided and circular in section, and very often the base is four-sided, and then the drum, the part above it, is circular, and without question, this is the beginning of the tall structure, and this will reach the capital city of the Northern Wei, Luoyang. Another place that provides accurate, I would say accurate evidence, but in detail, is something like this. Hunping translates as soul jar. The majority of them come from southeastern China. There are a lot of them in the new Six Dynasties Museum in the city of Nanjing. If you haven't been there, I encourage you to go. It's a wonderful museum. Some of them come from the neighboring province of Anhui. This is for funerary remains, but we have details of features like roofs that people also have to take seriously for reconstruction. We have paintings. And we have paintings like this that is dated to the 6th century that tells us that cities or palatial or religious or built environment is enclosed on 4 sides by walls with a front gate, with ceramic tile roofs and with decoration at the corners of those roofs that's called owl's tails. These are craftsmen who build these buildings. Craftsman's jargon very much is in process, and this is from a mural in the eastern part of Gansu province. The place is called Maijishan. We have excellent, outstanding evidence of ceilings from the 4th century. So if you have been on a Silk Road trip and you've been to Kucha, the Kucha region in Kumtura, you've seen the 2 ceilings above. These are pure domes, and they are dated to the 4th century, much earlier than I think people at one time expected China to be able to accomplish a pure dome. And below it are embedded quadrilaterals, a kind of ceiling that's sometimes called a lantern ceiling, sometimes it's called a caisson ceiling. It's from Kizil, also in the Kucha region, and it dates a little bit later. So here's why I started in the Han Dynasty. And you will see the Han Dynasty resonating through everything that I show you up until the 580s, when the dynasties unite again. The Han made all the ceilings that I just showed you. When China splits in 220 and stays divided and new people come in and out of China, what you will find is people using what they see in front of them. Or if they happen to go underground and see what's in a tomb, people are using what's there. And the Han tradition keeps resonating, and it is a clear source of almost any structure that stands on Chinese soil up to the last dynasty Qing and the Forbidden City, both in detail and in actual structure. I mentioned Koguryo because it is going to loom large in a few minutes. Koguryo, all these names are on the study guide, and I'd rather have your eyes up here, so if you go back and look at the study guide later, you will find Koguryo, and you probably know there are alternate spellings for all of the Korean terms. So there was a point when I used what you see here, the official spelling, and then South Korean students said, well, it's not nationalistic unless you use our new spelling. So then I changed and spelled this G-O-G-U-R-Y-E-O. And then I, of course, have Korean colleagues at Penn. The purists say, well, that's not really phonetically correct. Use the old spellings. I put both on your study guide. Most of my slides, I think I switched back to what the purist Korean professors say. But however you spell it, the most complicated ceilings that survive from anywhere in East Asia up until the 8th century are in Koguryo tombs that date from late 4th into the 7th century, and these are just 4 versions, but this is not something that Koguryo can take credit for. This is something that builds out of a Han tradition. The Han were also in what's today North Korea, and it's Han building techniques that are used. Also from the 4th century, material that isn't very well known, but nothing begins out of nothing, as I said. From the 4th century, again, the Kucha region, north central Xinjiang province today, a site called Doldal Akar in brick has both the scroll on the right, that if it looks to you like the end of an Ionic column, it should, and some people will always like to talk about the Silk Roads and Greece and Rome coming to China. It's hard to prove, but whether or not this originally comes from the Mediterranean, this scroll end is built in Xinjiang province in the 4th century, north of the stupas that I showed you. And below, I would say this is not just pure decoration. I think this simulates what a bracket set looks like. And so whatever building material people are using, you are seeing the elements of a world of migration all coming together before we finally get to the 5th century. Also from the 4th century, and something I'm going to show you again, and probably the reason I decided I had to really start in the 4th century. This is a tomb excavated in Gansu province. The site is called Digongpo. And when I first read the archaeology report about it, I said impossible, and I began to send emails to colleagues in China. And they said, we have a location, we have objects inside the tomb, this is in a cemetery. It has to be 4th century. It's a period we call Wei Jin. And it is, I have to take their word for it, it is 4th century. And if this is 4th century, as I said at the beginning, looking underground is rewriting the history of Chinese architecture as we speak. The first thing that you see isn't just a column, you see entasis. And if that is the bulging in the middle that we associate with Greece, I'm not going there here. I am not saying Greece transmitted this to the 4th century, or even necessarily that there's a Han connection. But somebody who was building in the 4th century above ground knew that if the column swells in the middle, this is builder's technique, it's going to be more stable. And then we have the part that's called the truss. You see parts of a triangle in the slide on the right. And there's no post in the middle. There's no king post. People are always looking for details, and this is one of them. Is it just a triangle, or is there a post in the middle? Details that can date a building. And so it's also very significant, and I'll show you why when we get to the Tang Dynasty, that there's no king post here, and this is a wooden ceiling frame. So this is an extraordinary tomb, and if there's one, as I will say again, there should be more than one. Now, this is a unique kind of architecture from the 4th century, and I am in Jilin province, northeastern China, and it's again Koguryo. It's called a mountain castle, and there are dozens of these that survive in North Korea and eastern Mongolia into Jilin and Liaoning provinces of China today. This is the best example I can show you, the earliest best example of the merging of landscape with architecture. This is on a mountain, and the architecture is built into it so that it's a fortification as well as a palace. It's called a mountain castle, and this is exactly what it looks like. So we have had, so this is what we have from the period before the 5th century, and now we look at the map again to see some of the names, and I want to show you, because the map won't come up again, the place called Jiuquan, which is far, let me see, oh, I think I have a, I want to show you Jiuquan in Gansu province. We are going to be looking at Gansu in some detail. This part of China right here, it's sometimes called the Heshi corridor, the corridor west of the Yellow River, and I will have a few more maps in a minute, but I wanted to show that one again. If I were to choose two buildings as the two that I would use to represent all of East Asian architecture during this period, this is probably what I would choose. I would choose the Songyue Pagoda up until it was restored in the 21st century, and I would choose the interior of a Buddhist cave with this flat ceiling at the top, but we still have our embedded quadrilaterals, and an example of the merging of architecture, painting, and sculpture to create a Buddhist space. So I choose these two examples for another reason, and that is because even though it's positive that Buddhism existed in pockets in China in the Han Dynasty, it's after the Han Dynasty, when non-Chinese rulers come, that Buddhism really comes into its own in China. And so I intentionally am also choosing Buddhist monuments. And now I'm showing you something that I doubt you've seen, and Anne mentioned a book that is just about to appear, and you will see this in that book. So, using the evidence of archaeology, small-scale architecture, painting, and relief sculpture, and the few buildings that survive, and using the Mogao caves at Dunhuang, we're talking about a lot today. Mogao and Dunhuang kind of come in and out, but I'm not really talking about Dunhuang. It is possible for me to give you a chronology, stylistic development of how the timber frame building works from around the 4th, 5th century into the Tang Dynasty. And it works in 5 phases. So phase 1, that's on the left, is a building whose walls are mud earth. And even though there is some kind of wooden framing on the top, it's a building that's entirely supported by the earth itself, by mud, earth, brick, something like that. The change towards the timber frame, which of course is the signature of Chinese architecture, is phase 2. Now you're noting that I'm not putting dates here. And I wouldn't put dates except the rough dates I gave you, 4th century to about the year 600 or into the 7th century, because excavation can change anything. A new find can change anything. What I can tell you is that logic of construction tells you this is how architecture evolves. The beginning of the use of a timber frame occurs only as one additional bay, one additional unit of space in the front, where you have 2 pillars which can be either wooden or not wooden, and some framing at the top. And now you see the reason why there is a triangular truss without the additional king post there. And what you're seeing below are pictures from Buddhist caves that show you evidence of how this all works. I moved to phase 3, where the front bay only is independent and independently supporting the roof, so that the pillars that you see on the left actually join, piece on the top, a horizontal piece called a lintel, and bracket sets actually join into that lintel or join into the pillars, but the 2 sides and the back are still mud earth, or if they have pillars in them, they have mud earth built around them to support that building. The turn towards greater use of timber is phase 4, where you can see that through the building we have the triangular trusses, but the building is still supported by pillars front, middle, back, and although the pillars are offering more support, the side and back walls still bear some weight. And finally, as we get to the little dynasty called Sui, at some point between the 580s and 618, we actually have a wooden frame. And now, it doesn't exist in China, and even in Japan it doesn't exist from as early as 600. But we have enough evidence on small scale in materials other than wood for people to feel fairly certain that what I'm showing you is accurate. But what I am showing you is framing across what we call the longitudinal dimension. That is, you have pillars and bracket sets and a frame above from the front to the back of the building. We're not going to get that far, but if I took you to the year 1000, the support system is reversed. It's lateral. It's across the sides where one sees this kind of framing. And people often say, and I can argue it, I could give a lecture arguing that all Chinese architecture looks alike. They often say all Chinese architecture looks alike, and then they don't really know what to do with it. That's because the roof is always identifying it as Chinese, and that's important for China's image. And the pillars and the timber frame are always used. This is China's signature. But when you take it apart, there definitely are structural differences that now, because there's enough excavated material, can be tracked from around the 4th century and on. So the way that the pillars are placed may still be a grid of columns inside, but the actual frames that hold the building up change directions. It is also possible now to show an evolution in tomb plan from the Han Dynasty up to around the 7th century, and that's what I'm showing you, excuse me, right here. These are Han tombs. They're large, they have a lot of rooms, they have rooms across a main axial line, and they have side niches. And this is a pre-Buddhist world, to which people enter the tomb with the clear hope that there will be an afterlife for them to enjoy. And so they spare no expense, and they make the structure as big as the land that they've purchased above ground that it is under. Similar kinds of tombs exist in the 3rd century. And most of the builders, and I'm not mentioning where they are because they're across China, and the builders are still primarily non-Buddhist. The change occurs around the 4th century. This is the Digungpo tomb. I chose it because you still have an entry and 2 rooms and 2 side niches, and you have this triangular truss. That's why I wanted to show it to you. But it is a smaller, more compact space because Buddhism is already in China. And I won't get to the 5th and 6th centuries yet. I'm in actually the early 6th century. But now I'm going to move more in a more focused way to what is our topic today. So I was thrilled when I was asked to do East Asia, because what I'm going to do is give you a few examples that show what architecture looks like in East Asia across our spectrum. The tomb of King Muryong of Paekche, his dates are here. It's in South Korea. It's near Kongju, not Gyeongju, Kongju, eastern side. Anybody here been to that tomb? Probably. If you've gone to, oh, that's amazing. Okay, I don't think anybody's been there. It's a very easy tourist site to get to. It's very open, and it does look just as you see it here. It is, and I will show you here where it is, because that's important to the narrative. So here is the city of Nanjing that will be important. And here is the Paekche kingdom, and here's Shilla, and here's Koguryo that we have looked at. And I will come back to this map in just a minute. So it is only a 1-chamber tomb with a small antechamber. So this already fits in with the decreasing size of tombs as we're moving into the 5th century. I haven't shown you much from the 5th century yet. But what I am interested in here is the placement of bricks. The bricks are placed in vertical rows and horizontal rows of either 3 or 4. And this is the formation of brick that we see around the city of Nanjing in the Southern dynasties. Southern dynasties beginning around 265, when China is briefly united under the Western Jin, and then continuing until the collapse of the Chun Kingdom in 589. So, city of Nanjing. On the left has a number of tombs with the theme of the 7 worthies. Your old books called them the 7 sages of the bamboo grove. And we see the same kind of vertical and horizontal placement of brick. And this makes people really happy because everything works. And what I mean by that is that It is believed that things begin in China and they move to Korea, and this is Chinese capital, and here is Pekche. And what's more, there's an inscription in King Muryong's tomb that says that the bricks are copied from bricks made by the Liang dynasty. That is one of the 6 dynasties. So that really works. And this is even better. This is a tomb that was excavated in Nanjing in either 2011 or 2012, and it is definitely from the Wu Kingdom. This is one of the 3 kingdoms into which China divides upon the fall of Han. So the date has to be 3rd century, and we have the vaulted ceiling, and we have the same formation of bricks. So it begins in the south, continues in the south, goes to Pekche, except that no one who has looked at these tombs has looked in Gansu province. And I've already said to you, Gansu is going to loom large during this period. What you're looking at on the lower right is a tomb in Jiaoyuguan. It was on the map from the period of the 16 states. You have the dates that this is believed to be Western Jin. This is a brief period when China, at least nominally, is unified. And we have the vertical bricks, the horizontal bricks. We have some inset pictures, and we also have some inset pieces in the tomb, which we have in King Muryong's tomb, for wax or a candle that is a light source. So how did it get to Gansu? Could it have gone from Gansu to Nanjing? No, not if the date of the tomb I showed you in Nanjing is really 220 to 280. Probably this is yet another formation that begins in the Han Dynasty, or the earliest source is the city of Nanjing, but it moves in 2 directions. One of the themes of so I put up another map to show you again where Gansu is, which is, so Nanjing, Pekche, and Gansu is over here. This is Chang'an or Xi'an. So Gansu is over here, and we will be back in Korea in just a moment. And Pingcheng is the city that is Datong today. One of the facts, and I won't call it a theme, I'll call it a fact. One of the facts of Chinese architecture and of Buddhist art and of art in general during this period of more than 30 polities is that art and ideas do not move unidirectionally. And if you are taking a first-year course on the arts of China as a freshman, someone might show you a way to see the evolution of the Buddha image beginning in India and ending up in Japan, and we can build that scenario. But by the time you get to your next course, that scenario breaks down. Movement is not unidirectional, and this is just one example that proves it. Now, Goguryeo. This is a different kingdom. Korea is divided into 3 kingdoms, and one of the other facts, I would just call it a fact, that someone who looks at the architecture of this period learns is that these 3 kingdoms, although they are at war and peace with each other, are building in very different ways. They are really almost functioning, in my opinion, as 3 countries, 3 very small countries, and Gaia would be a 4th, but no one is going to change the name of the period to the period of the 4 kingdoms. But there really are 4 functioning during this period, and Goguryeo is the one, not just with the ceilings that I've shown you, but with images like that. Keep that in mind. We will get back there. So now I am back in Gansu province. I am in the town called Jiaochuan, and you saw it on a map, and it won't be the last map that you see. The site is called Dingjiajia. The names don't roll off the tongue, but that's the site. You can think of it as the Jiaochuan tomb if you want. It was built by someone who was living in the 16 kingdoms. It's built by some ruler or elite member of society who could afford a tomb. It has 2 rooms. One has a pure vaulted ceiling. One has a different kind of ceiling, and the first room still retains all of its painting. And the painting, getting inside, the painting cannot be separated from the architecture because the painting is as tied to this union of art and traveling of art in the period as the architecture itself. So we have 3 levels of society. I'll say society. We have a deity up here, and some of you may recognize the fox, and you may recognize the 3-toed crow, and you may say, oh, Queen Mother of the West. Yes, this has to be the Queen Mother of the West. And then moving down, we have the tomb occupant, umbrella over his head, canopy over him to identify him. He's being entertained. And then we have people tilling the fields below. This is a beautiful painting. This is a very skilled painter for circa 400 in Gansu province. So another detail of what you just saw. The king father of the east is on the other side, and he also has his attributes, and so you're looking at a line drawing of what's on the other side. Service for the deceased is something that's a theme in Chinese funerary art from as long as anyone can track the remains of Chinese tombs. So here it's not 3-dimensional objects like one might find in the Han Dynasty. It's painted on the walls. A flowering tree. This is a subject that we will see in this next little section. A beautiful flowering tree. But there is always something in a tomb that tells you geographically where it is. There's always something that identifies the nativity of its occupant. And what it is here is architecture. So here we have 2 examples, and we have seen another wall already. We have adobe architecture, if I can use a southwestern term. I have mud brick architecture, which is the construction material of the desert of Gansu province with some kind of fortification on the top. So this is someone who is a ruler or elite in one of the 16 kingdoms. So here is his identification, and I'm emphasizing the tree. And as I said, the painting is extraordinary. Someone who studies architecture doesn't need to apologize if what's inside in the murals is more interesting than the building. This is, I think, one of the greatest painters that survives from the year 400 in China, and I'm happy to have an opportunity to show what's on the walls, and a lotus at the top. Now, this raises another question that looms large in this period between the 5th and 7th centuries. Is every lotus Buddhist? Not necessarily. If you believe that, if you've read that, if you've been told it, then that's another myth that we should break down today. A lotus is the vehicle out of which the Buddha is born, or a person can be reborn in paradise. I'm just about to show you an example of it. But in a tomb where there is no evidence of Buddhism, it appears on a ceiling as it appears in Han tombs, probably as a water plant that symbolically would put out fire. That's one reason one sees lotuses on ceilings, but also as something beautiful that's a symbol available in East Asia for someone to put on a tomb or a cave temple wall. Now I am back in Koguryo. I'm on the Chinese side of Koguryo, but the Koguryo kingdom included, as I think I said, part of China, part of North Korea today, part of Russia, part of Mongolia. I'm looking at a 2-chamber tomb. The chambers are joined by a corridor, and in both line drawing and some pictures from the walls, we have guardians. But what is most interesting is that here we actually have a Buddhist deity. We have the occupant, whoever it was, making obeisance to the Buddha. We have other elevated beings with umbrellas above their heads. We have lotus vehicles for rebirth in Buddhist paradise. And so two of the ceilings, two of the pieces of the ceiling, I'm showing you this one, because even this creature who appears in Han Dynasty tombs, this is an undated tomb, probably 5th century, maybe around the year 500, is on a lotus. This poor soul is also being reborn in paradise. In line drawing, I am showing you that in this Buddhist world, we have one of the animals associated with the Chinese directions, that is native Chinese thought. We have our flowering tree, which we just saw in Gansu province. And how do I know that I am in Northeast Asia or Korea? Because the spotted fur garments, probably ermine, maybe leopard, are what people who live in the Northeast need to wear to keep warm. There's always something here that tells us where we are, but the elements mix up and can be used in a Buddhist context and can be used in a non-Buddhist context. The ceiling of the tomb with the Buddhist context has the big and little dipper and the raven in the sun and the toad in the moon, which are native Chinese symbols, and I wanted to give a better picture of this, but also to show you this is rebirth in Buddhist paradise. And it is in a tomb where, in a part of East Asia that is not as heavily Buddhist, but this is what the lotus really is, and it's mixed in with the Chinese directional animals. So left is Gansu and right is Koguryo. And they both have the tree, and they both have the sign of the nativity, and they both present along registers. And the other point here is I've just shown you two tombs from Gansu, and I've shown you two tombs from two different Korean kingdoms. And the two Gansu tombs are only 25 kilometers apart. So this is what the 5th century is all about: movement, transmigration, and this world of symbols that are available. So another map. So Korea's off this map. I've mentioned Datong. Here's the spelling Jiayuguan, but it's on the study guide also. And movement doesn't exactly go this way, but it exists here, exists here, exists here, and that's a rough line of where the Great Wall would be. And what I've just shown you also goes back, in my opinion, to the Han Dynasty. So I look at the Wu family shrines, and I look at the flowering tree, and I look at the Queen Mother of the West, and I look at a hierarchical explanation of the universe with the Queen Mother who becomes the Buddha in Koguryo, and then the deity, then the emperors, and then the paragons of filial piety. This is where the tomb occupant comes in, and then people just servicing life, moving across life in chariots. This is an object you've probably seen, but it relates to the worldview that is contained in architecture in circa the 5th century. It was excavated in Guyuan. It's known as the Guyuan sarcophagus. It's found by salvage archaeology. It's lacquer. What you are looking at on the left is what it actually looks like. I took this in the basement of the Archaeology Institute in Guyuan, where they have the pieces attached to backing. This is probably as good as it will get. I don't think there was any way to restore it beyond what you're seeing here. It's easier to see in line drawing. No date, no known occupant. People like the date circa 480s. Queen Mother of the West and King Father of the East, each labeled. Raven in the sun, toad in the moon. The constellations come down the middle. We've seen the big and little dippers just now in Koguryo. And here's the Buddha, but here our occupant identifies himself as someone who comes from the north. We have to assume this is a non-Chinese lord, if not ruler, because he's wearing leggings, he's wearing boots, he's wearing probably a leather cap, he's wearing a heavy garment, and he puts himself in China by putting himself under a Chinese roof. That's why it always looks alike. You always know that China's present. But he has on two sides of him the Buddha, and if you've seen this, you're not shocked, but if you haven't seen this, I hope you're shocked. These are paragons of Chinese filial piety on the sides of his sarcophagus. So the story of the filial son who decides that he will sacrifice his mother, and then as he's about to sacrifice his son to save his mother because he can't afford to feed them both, and as he's about to dig the son's grave, he literally finds a pot of gold. This is not the best artisan in the 5th century in East Asia, but all the details that identify themselves are there. So here's the pot of gold story. And this one is the many legends of the man Xuan, who is going to become the Chinese emperor. It's an evil stepmother story. His stepmother puts him in a well and tries to drown him so that her own son can inherit what the father has, and he manages to get out of the well and comes to the attention of royalty and ends up marrying not one, but two of the daughters of legendary Emperor Xuan. Somebody who built a tomb for himself or herself, but there's a man here in Guyuan, in Ningxia Autonomous Region between Shanxi and Gansu Province, put scenes of filial piety, Taoist Queen Mother and King Father, Buddhist deities, and his own nativity onto his sarcophagus. Oh yeah, and he also put on the Sasanian roundel, and he put on the Parthian shot, and he put on floral motifs. So this is a time of a universe of forms that are moving in and out of architectural space and find themselves on walls and find themselves in places. You can want me to, okay, this will be the last thing I show. I think people want to take a break. The last thing I show relevant to this movement of forms is a tomb in Astana. This is one of the oldest pieces of paper that survives from China, 4th century. And we should not be surprised to see the occupant with the umbrella, the raven in the sun, the toad in the moon, the flowering tree, the food service, the Big and Little Dipper, and the horse and rider. So that's the world of circa 5th century. We'll start a second example of how architecture and what decorates it moves across East Asia, not in straight lines, and bounces around back and forth. And we're going to continue that a little bit, but I wanted to look for a moment at the city of Datong, which is a city that many of you, I think, know if you visited the Yungang Caves. The Yungang Caves are in Datong, but Datong is much more than just the Yungang Caves patronized by the Northern Way. Datong is really the city where Northern Way takes shape, and it flourishes from around the year 400 to the year 493. From that city, there's a lot of recent excavation. By recent, I mean end of the 1990s up until today. And if you remember, I said we looked at Han tombs, and we looked at 3rd century tombs, and we looked at 4th century tombs. Here we're looking at 5th century tombs, and this is the kind of picture that wasn't available to people in the 1900s, but there's lots of pictures like this that come out of China now. So one very large tomb on the left with an entry ramp and 2 chambers and a little passageway between them. This is the kind of tomb, this is the tomb plan that we just saw in Koguryo and in Gansu, right? So here's Datong, Jiayuguan, Koguryo is over here off the map. We're looking at 2 chamber tombs and 1 chamber tombs, and as I mentioned, they are becoming increasingly smaller. This is another tomb from a nearby cemetery, city of Datong, the Hudong Cemetery, where yet another lacquer sarcophagus was excavated with the pearls in a circle, the roundel pattern that traces to Sasanian Iran, with someone wearing the headgear that identifies him as a person from the north who's probably not Chinese. So I mention that because I have a last example of how this world of symbols and forms in East Asia comes together in the 5th century. We are in the Binglingsa cave. This is, Binglingsa is a Buddhist cave site that you get to by water, but it's not that hard to get to, but you get there by water. And cave 169 has received more attention, I think, than any single cave anywhere in China as to whether the date is 420 or 424. And to me, given the state of knowledge about, one person wrote a 300-page 2 chapters of a book about this. She got the book published, and it's kind of amazing. And her date is 420. But what you're looking at is what that cave looks like on the inside and what that cave looks like on the inside. And it's very early, and if this group has studied the evolution of the Buddha image, and I'm sure you have, you are seeing hints of the kind of statuary we associate with Gandhara, but now I'm showing you something different in this cave. There is a detail in the cave that you are seeing here. Here's our Buddha, here are 2 bodhisattvas, and I am interested in these 3 figures. They are women, they wear pleated skirts. And so now I am interested in them because the same pleated skirt, but different headgear, because I am farther north, and I'm in a different one of the 16 states. We've got that here. And here I'm in Koguryo with the pleated skirts. And here I'm in Japan. Japan will only come up a little bit today, but it definitely will come up. This is from the wall of a tomb in Japan that dates around the year 700. It's the Takamatsuzuka. People have associated it with Korea because of what the women wear, but it's in Japan, and it could well be a Japanese tomb because what you're looking at is just yet another example of how motifs travel. A lot of our best evidence of architecture in the 5th century does come from the city of Datong, specifically the Yungang Caves. And this is where we see architecture really emerging to take its role, its fundamental role in not just Chinese art, but in identifying China. Buddhism brings from India 3 fundamental forms. We've already talked about the stupa, the reliquary mound, and the place where the mortal remains of the Buddha would be, but the symbol of the Buddha's death. And I've mentioned to you that through the history of Buddhist architecture in China, the pagoda can change its position and change its shape. In the Yungang caves that we date to the 470s and 480s, we see the merging of an entryway into a Buddhist cave temple. These are Buddhist cave temples, and a pointed horseshoe-shaped arch. European term is the ogi-shaped arch, O-G-E-E, which is incorporated into China as a Chinese element. And you will see it for centuries in Chinese Buddhist architecture as how the cave temple becomes Chinese. But what you see more is really how the cave temple becomes Chinese, just as the man on the lacquer sarcophagus in his Guyuan tomb sits under a Chinese roof. In the Yungang caves, we have our owl's tails. They're just off the map here. We have our inverted V-shaped braces that alternate with very simple bracket sets. We have a framework that would be between something like stage 2 or stage 3 of the picture that I showed you. But it's architecture that tells us that this Buddhist world is in China, and there are some much better examples. Some of you have been to the Yungang caves, no doubt. Yeah, definitely, okay, definitely been to the Yungang caves, then you know how this works, this overkill of imagery, and how even the entry to a cave will give you a timber frame, but the material is earth or stone, and this simulates a Chinese building where it's merging with architecture of the Buddhist world from India. So the next topic from this period of the 5th century onward begins in Datong, and it is the evolution of the Buddhist monastery. And here, no matter what you've read, unless you've read as recently as the last year or two, and you're reading in Chinese, you haven't seen the whole story. What you see here is a monastery whose name translates, a plan, of course, building plan. Monastery of the Great Courtyard. It's in the northern suburbs of the city of Datong, and the excavation plan is a pagoda with an outer core centered inside a courtyard and centered inside another courtyard. One major towering pagoda. The date is got to be earlier than 493 because that's when the capital is going to move. So this is where I like to show this. Some of you were interested in Chinese art when the Ma Wangdui painting was first excavated and first appeared. It was around 1973, and I can remember studying the Ma Wangdui painting myself. And then a couple years later, the painting on the right was excavated. And suddenly what was unique and fantastic, but people didn't know what to do with it, became part of the ideology of something that's made all across China, and there are examples of these now outside the region in Hunan province where this was excavated. This explosion of information is going on right now with what a Chinese Buddhist monastery looked like. So between the excavation, which is published, that I showed you from the city of Datong, are excavations that I'm not showing you pictures of because I don't have the right to, but they will be published and you will see pictures eventually. On top of the Yungang caves, including Yungang Cave 37, if you go with the right archaeologist, are remains of two Buddhist monasteries with a central pagoda that is going to tower. There are now three. The pagoda is four-sided, and they're all in the city of Datong. And so far, this works in terms of a clear evolution from 5th century monasteries that are built only with one central towering pagoda and not clear yet what's around it. The second type of monastery has a date of 516. It's constructed in the city of Luoyang, which becomes the Buddhist capital. I've already said this a couple times. In 493, the monastery burns in 534. What the pagoda looks like is what this pagoda looks like is what this pagoda looked like. A central core with construction around it, and it's not clear how much wood there was and how much is built up with earth. But it's the reconstruction plan of the core. We have a gate, we have a towering pagoda, and now we have a Buddha hall behind it. Directly behind it, one straight line. So I've gone from before 493 to 516. And this is the pagoda I showed you at the beginning. It did burn. Now I'm giving you a third possible reconstruction. It's not clear if it projects straight up and the perimeter is the same side on every level, or if there's a tapering from the base level to the top. And this is something I also doubt you've seen, but this is published, so I show it here. In the western hills of the city of Taiyuan, capital of Shanxi province today, north-central China, this monastery called the Tongzi Monastery has a date because of additional evidence from excavated material or Buddhist statuary and its location, Northern Qi, 550 to 577. So now I'm giving you a clear progression and a roughly unilinear movement. But what I am interested in is the plan that has an entry and a main corridor and a Buddha hall, and the pagoda might have been small, or there are two side structures and it is not clear what they are. And now also from the Northern Qi, but a different Northern Qi capital, a monastery that was excavated in a town called Jiaopengcheng. And it's known as the Jiaopengcheng Monastery in the capital. And its plan is the plan of a monastery with an earthen core and some use of wood and a perimeter around it with the date of 550 to 577. These are the first pictures that came out, and these came out around 2009, 2010. And people looked at the picture and said, we have another example of the Yongning Monastery with the Buddha hall and the gate in front of it and a pagoda dominating. That's not what turned up exactly. What's turned up is a pagoda, but two larger structures in paired fashion on either side. And no one has found the right text that tells us what they are, and no one has yet come out and said twin pagodas, but certainly architectural twinning in two monasteries from the Northern Qi. So I'm 550 to 577, and now I put them together. And again, when there's one, it's interesting. When there are two, now we're really talking about what was going on in North China during this 27-year period of Northern Qi. Now no one would just put up a pagoda with flat sides made of plaster. I don't know that anyone will do a theoretical reconstruction. It hasn't happened so far. So how does one understand it? One turns to Korea. And I said that people who follow Korean art may be surprised at how much I'm going to show you from Korea. More than Japan and definitely more than China. The three Korean kingdoms retain Buddhist monastery architecture, and each kingdom has a plan associated with it. So this is the kind of working system that couldn't be better, okay? So the first picture shows you how large Koguryo was at one time. Much of it's in North Korea today. The material's hard to access because of Buddhist statues that survive and because of how the proximity with Japan. We know a lot more about Pekche and Showa. But you can see where Northern Qi is, an Eastern Way, and you can also see people like the Turks who are listed on the chronology I gave you. Three remains of Koguryo monasteries. Large, towering pagoda in the center, and at least two, if not three, Buddha halls, and two of them appear as twin structures. I will get to the entire monastery again in a moment. I'm showing you one entire monastery, and then right now I'm really just looking at the two pictures on the top, and the pagoda is octagonal. There's discussion among architectural historians of Korea about whether this possibly could have had a wooden frame or if it was brick. And of course, no one here, I won't even ask if anybody's been to North Korea. I don't think anybody here fought in the Korean War, but I certainly haven't been there. No one has firsthand information, but excavators say there are pieces of wood and maybe there was a wooden frame, and that, of course, would be extraordinary. We don't know. Monastery type number 2, my old spelling, but both spellings. The Pekche Monastery has a gate, a pagoda, and a Buddha hall all in one line, and sometimes a building behind it, and that building would be the lecture hall. So, gate, pagoda, Buddha hall, gate, pagoda, Buddha hall, etc. And this is our Yongning Monastery plan that we just saw in the Northern Way capital of Luoyang. And so I bring this in because it's the other evidence that really confirms what we're looking at. On the right is a head from the Yongning Monastery that you see in one of the museums in Luoyang, one of the many museums in Luoyang. And if you go to the remains of the Chongrimsa from the Paekche Kingdom in southeastern Korea, but again, these are not difficult places to access from Seoul, you are going to see that the same, you are going to see that the same kind of headgear is used. So, Yongning Monastery, Luoyang, Paekche, but what you can see I'm doing with Paekche, I'm now only in the 6th century. What I'm doing is I'm watching things move around and I'm only taking my physical evidence as my real evidence. This is one of the most interesting of the Korean monasteries. We know the king who built it, and so you have his reign dates here. It's the Miruksa, 600 to 660. What do we do with the plan? Well, we can do two things with the plan at least. We have a gate, we have a towering Buddha hall, a towering pagoda, we have a Buddha hall behind it, and we have a lecture hall. We also have twin pagodas. We also have a towering pagoda with 3 Buddha halls behind it. We have actually a composite of all 3 plans. And this is almost when Korea is going to unify under the Shilla kingdom, but this is still Paekche. The Shilla kingdom identifies itself for twin pagodas. And what we just looked at from China, from northern Qi, 550 to 577, we have twin structures, and it's not certain they were pagodas. But by the time we get to the 600s and the 7th century, not just in Korea, but as you're about to see in Japan, we have twin pagodas. So that when we go back here and look at the monastery Miruksa, people are not surprised to see the twin pagodas along with the Buddha halls. But now we come to the 3rd kingdom. The 3rd kingdom is Shilla. The city where one goes to see Shilla remains is Gyeongju. This is the new spelling. I think this is the Hwangnyeongsa. I think this is the new spelling also of the monastery. This is the excavation site as it survives. Now this is even more interesting. Hwangnyeongsa went through 3 building periods. It doesn't come into existence until these dates, Gate, Pagoda, Buddha Hall. By the time we move into the middle of the 8th century, as late as the middle of the 8th century, now we have our 3 Buddha halls, our Koguryo plan, which actually was built in another Korean kingdom earlier. And then by the middle of the 8th century, we have the twin towers, we have the pagoda, we have 3 Buddha halls. And this is where I look when I look at the northern Qi monasteries that I just showed you from China. In other words, it's not neat and tidy as one might like it, but this is the physical evidence as of today. Hwangnyeongsa had a towering pagoda, that's for sure. A reconstruction like this relies on the most advanced archaeological survey and measuring and calculations of how large the site is, and knowing that it had a wooden frame, how tall the pagoda would have towered. So the Hwangnyeongsa with its towering pagoda, the one I just showed you that has 3 building periods, 3rd building period on the right, and the Miruksa. So in other words, Korea, which is, if we can use the old scenario at least now, China, Korea, Japan, the takeoff point for a lot that will go to Japan that may not come directly from China. These monastery plans are kind of commingled in the 7th century on the Korean peninsula. So this is what we have just seen, except now I've brought Japan into the mix. Koguryo plan has an octagonal pagoda and 3 Buddha halls around it, and a gate. The Pekche plan is represented by what you see here, 3 parallel examples, or this represents the pagoda with 3 Buddha halls. This version from this time period of Hwangryongsa, pagoda, 3 Buddha halls, and here's the later version. And now I'm in Japan, and my date here is 588, and I have a pagoda, and I have 3 Buddha halls around it, and I have a lecture hall here, and I have a gate. I am in the city of Asuka. People always love to go to Nara, me too. It's one of my favorite cities in the world. Things only begin in Nara in 710. If you're in Nara, you definitely want to go 2 subway stops south to the Horyuji, to Ikaruga. But you really want to go yet another subway stop south. And that's where you come to Asuka. And that's where we are right now, and that's where the point from which we trace the beginnings of monastery architecture, Buddhist monastery architecture in Japan. Now, we have some clear dates again. I didn't give you the dates for the 3 Korean kingdoms, but Buddhism came to Koguryo first in 372. It came to Pekche in 384. It didn't come to Showa until the year 527. The date that most people use for the entry of Buddhism to Japan is 538, and a Buddha image is supposed to have come from the king of Pekche. But what we see in Asuka, and you're looking at the city plan on the right, and if it looks like Nara and it looks like Kyoto, this is a city modeled after a Chinese city plan. Asuka-dera is dated 588. This is the earliest evidence of a Buddhist monastery in Japan to date. It has a gate, a central pagoda, 3 Buddha halls around it, and a lecture hall at the back. I should have put the date for Asuka-dera, that is certain. What you're seeing here is material that is not well published, but it is published, including in English. And this is a monastery in Asuka called the Kudara Odera. If you've read the history of architecture in Japan, you've heard about the 4 great temples or the 4 great monasteries of Nara. Their predecessor is the 4 great monasteries of Asuka, all of which have now been excavated. Kudara Odera's plan there's no resolution yet because there isn't enough from excavation to show everything. But the change and the date for this it was founded in 639. 2 gates. Here's your lecture hall. 1 gate to the pagoda, 1 gate to the Buddha hall. They're Japanese, the Golden Hall is the translation of the Japanese name of the Buddha hall, but I've been calling it a Buddha hall. It's not clear if the lecture hall was here or here, but what we are seeing is interpreted as the emerging importance of the Buddha hall. So you remember the pagoda comes from the Indian stupa. The rock-carved cave temple is known as a chaitya in India, and its archway still can be found inside and very, very occasionally at an entryway to a Buddhist cave in China. The monastery itself, the vihara, is the last to come to East Asia, and China, Korea, and Japan are civilizations that do things indoors, including worship. So the Buddha hall is something new that doesn't exist in India, and there isn't good evidence for how it existed in the deserts of Central Asia. But there has to be a resolution of what the early Buddhist monastery looks like. What I showed you just now from China is all that we have. The newest excavation is going to come from on top of the Yungang caves. What I showed you from Korea is 3 plans, each associated with the kingdom. Japan has always been known to have the most complicated monastery plan, and excavators who came to Kudara Odera beginning in the 1990s are still discussing what was really there. But that's the second of the great monasteries. The third is called Kawara-dera, and you see it right here. So this is one with a pagoda and a Buddha hall, each in its own precinct, one gate now, and then other architecture like a lecture hall behind it. But I am interested in what I'm looking at right here. And this is a blow-up of what you see here and here. These are all the monasteries that survive in some fashion, even if it's only an archaeological site, in the vicinity of Asuka, which is really worth going to the next time you're in Japan. It's marked, it's easy to get around, and this is really the beginnings, earliest evidence of lots of Buddhist architecture in East Asia. So if you look here, you are seeing entryways on the east and west sides. This little monastery is called Tachibana-dera. It was built in 601. It burns. It's built again in the 680s. It is the Pekche plan, or the Yongning Buddhist monastery plan, with a gate, a pagoda, a Buddha hall, and a lecture hall. And it stood like this when this was built. But someone at some point realized, I think, one explanation is that Chinese architecture, and therefore Korean architecture, and therefore Japanese architecture should be oriented to the south. But for topographical reasons, or because the year was only 601, this is actually our Pekche monastery oriented that way. Personally, I think this is how this plan comes into being. And if you know the monastery Horyuji, and I will get there, it's a little bit later, that's the plan that's always puzzled people. Why are the Buddha hall and the pagoda side by side? I think it's the evolution of the Pekche plan. I can't prove it. It would be great if there were texts that said it. The fourth monastery in the city of Asuka is the Yakushi-ji. If you go to the city of Nara, you can visit the Yakushi-ji, and the date is 734. And there was a period when one of the twin pagodas, and they are twin pagodas, was reconstructed. And this is a dramatic picture. It's not my own. I wish it were. It's a great picture of the twin pagodas of the monastery Yakushi-ji in Nara. What we have from Asuka, its predecessor, is drawn like this, an architectural drawing of something that people haven't restored yet. There is discussion about whether, when the capital moves north after 690, if the monastery pieces or monastery buildings are dismantled and the pieces are put together in Nara. That's certainly a possibility, because almost nothing survives in Asuka, and a lot survives in Nara. So this is what we have been looking at all now from Japan. Asuka-dera, which is our Koguryo plan with the 3 Buddha halls around it. The Pekche plan, this is Tachibana-dera, this is Yamada-dera, this is the Shiten-no-ji in the city of Osaka. The date is 593. This is where we saw Kawara-dera Pagoda and Buddha Hall. Horyuji, I'm going to show you a real picture of it in just a minute. The pagoda and Buddha Hall are on other sides, and these are our twin pagodas of Yakushi-ji. And the reason I showed you the 22 buildings at the beginning is because this material from Japan has been set from even before I got into this field. People really thought they understood how Buddhist monasteries worked, and everything came together in Japan. And now people can't ignore what was going on in Korea and what was going on in China and is emerging from China, and it all has to be fit together. The next topic I want to look at from this building is something that is my own research, and it is how one building in an architectural setting of the early centuries, because I'm starting here in the Han Dynasty, but of the centuries from which the monasteries we're looking at here, 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, how one building relates to another building. and I therefore have to go back again to the Han Dynasty. In 1970, I think it's 1970, Paul Wheatley wrote a very, a book of high impact about Chinese urban planning called The Pivot of the Four Quarters. And he took Luoyang as his model, and he did everything. He was a geographer. He did everything based on text. There was almost no physical evidence. The term pivot of the four quarters could not be a better description of the Chinese capital. But it's only been proved since the 1990s. So I am in the Han Dynasty capital, Chang'an. And the first emperor's city, Xianyang, is north of the Wei River. And the first emperor built an axis that extended into Shuofang County in Inner Mongolia and extended in the south to the Han River to an area that's called the Ziwu Depression. So a depression here and a shrine here, the Tianqi Shrine. This is even farther north than this, but this is a much better map. This is a place where the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, put a pleasure palace. And he, of course, didn't expect to die at 51. Nobody can even estimate what his tomb would have looked like if he had lived as long as he hoped. But when he died, he hadn't yet added the other point, or it hasn't been found. The Chinese capital city, Chang'an, that takes as its precedent the building plan of the first emperor, certainly was a pivot of the four quarters in which, so this is the plan of the city, and these are the tombs of the first emperor and empress of the Han. Emperors and empresses each bury in their own mound side by side in the Han Dynasty. And this is the second emperor, and this is the fourth emperor. The tomb of the third emperor is down here. We won't go into Han history today. But what is for sure is that a line extended so that this palace and this palace, and this mound and this mound, and this building, all relate to the capital, which is the center of the Han universe. So how far can I take this, and what perhaps happens in the next period? What I've just shown you in a pre-Buddhist world is a relation between the imperial tomb and the palaces in the capital city and other architecture around it. I am back in Korea. I am in Koguryo, and I showed you this plan, and I said we would come back to it. So here is the monastery, the Chonmongsa, with the gate and the two Buddha halls and the pagoda and the two paired buildings and three Buddha halls and the lecture hall. And then we have this capital I-shaped building foundation, and you're looking at this map. It's in reverse here. A capital I-shaped building sorry, it's not in reverse. You have the same thing on both sides. The pagoda, the Buddha halls, the twin pavilions. This is this. It's not on the map. There are two of them. Capital I-shaped architecture is used only by royalty. Forbidden City, the core of the Forbidden City, the three supreme halls take the plan of a capital I. I've occasionally put some Chinese characters on the screen. This is one that has to be here. If you read characters, you know that this is the monastery determined by the tomb. I didn't show you this plan before, but I'm showing it to you now. Again, I haven't been to North Korea, but this is identified as the tomb of King Dongmyong, who reigned from 37 to 19 BCE, very, very, very early in the history of Koguryo. And the name tells me that the monastery was built in relation to the tomb. And in the capital city, Chang'an, where there are no monasteries, you saw two palaces, and there are palaces here, and you saw the emperor's tomb, and you saw them in relation to each other. Let's keep going. This is a plan that we've looked at as being the Paekche plan, second of the Korean kingdoms, the plan of the Yongning Monastery in the city of Luoyang. The gate, the Buddha hall, the gate, the pagoda, the Buddha hall, and the lecture hall. And I'm giving you the characters again. Here, it's just called the Monastery of the Tomb. And I don't have a map to show it to you, but from this monastery, if you go a few kilometers, you see 8 mounded tombs of the Paekche kings. So, relation between the royal tomb and the monastery, how far can we take this? The monastery in Fangshan, the monastery of the Great Courtyard, the Daiyuan Fo Monastery that I showed you when I began looking at Chinese Buddhist monasteries from the 5th century near the city of Datong, is in the vicinity of the burial mound of the empress who built, if not this monastery, then other monasteries in the Datong capital. So it seems to work. Now there's a second relationship that I want to propose when we look at architecture of this period of the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries. Hwangryongsa, I mentioned already that it's pagoda towers, and that there's excellent evidence from both archaeologists and architectural historians that confirm that it should have been a monumental pagoda like you see here. Now I go back to my excavation site. And if you go here, you stand here on the excavation site, and these steps lead up to the Buddha Hall. You will see right here the gateway of another monastery. This distance is 390 meters. So very, very short walk. The monastery gate that you're looking at is Buhwangsa. It's Gyeongju, it's in Gyeongju. 634. This is the period of the second building of the Hwangryongsa. The monastery behind it had a Buddha hall and twin pagodas, and one of those pagodas, at least at the base, survives. But nothing here was as tall as the pagoda of Hwangryong Monastery. A second relationship that I think existed during this period of the rise and flourishing and resolution of a few plans of Buddhist architecture is that once a monastery is built, especially with a tall pagoda, the second one that's built has to be built in response to it. I think that the towering pagoda of the Hwangryong Monastery functions as a protectorate structure, the glorious pagoda of the Gyeongju capital, and exerts a kind of protectorate influence over other architecture. So I go back now to China, and you remember I told you that the pagoda on the left is one of the 2 buildings I would choose as most important from China's 6th century. That's because the Yongning Monastery doesn't survive. The pagoda had burned in the 530s. But its reconstruction, based on measurements and what the texts say that it had a towering pagoda. This is on the sacred Buddhist peak Mount Sung, and the distance is about 70 kilometers from the capital. And I think that as excavation continues, we will see how clearly architecture, especially a towering pagoda, was built in response to other tall architecture. And there is a third relationship that I want to present, and there's actually better evidence for this, and this is the continued use of sacred space. It's long been known that the location of every Chinese capital today was the location of a city that usually traces to the 1st millennium BCE, if not earlier. But less well known is what happens when a city becomes Buddhist. And there is some research on this subject in China. And so you are looking at the city of Luoyang. You're looking at the Han city. You're looking at the Northern Wei city. And this is the ritual structure used by rulers. Its function is not completely understood, and it comes in various shapes. It's called a Mingtang, the bright hall, the luminous hall, the numinous hall that Han royalty had. When the Northern Wei come to Luoyang, they also build a Mingtang, but they destroy the one that had been built by Han, and they put the Jingming Monastery, one of the most important monasteries in the city of Luoyang, right on top of an enlarged space for the Mingtang. In other words, this relationship between architecture of power, like the Mingtang, or architecture of the founder of the Han Dynasty, his tomb, his palaces, and its relation to architecture that the first emperor of the Qin had laid out, continues in various relationships, temple to tomb, pre-Buddhist architecture to Buddhist architecture, in all the cities where architecture flourishes during this period. So that with continued excavation, I think it will be possible to map out the location of the pagoda, the location of the tomb, the location of the palace in cities like Pingcheng, that's the Northern Wei name of Datong, in cities like Jiankang, that's the Southern Dynasty's name of the city of Nanjing. This Songyue Monastery pagoda that I've shown you is also part of the continued use of sacred space. I showed you the gate towers of the Han Dynasty before. I showed you Chue. I didn't show you these two. The sacred Buddhist peak Mount Sung contains architecture erected by Han emperors. All that survives are 3 pairs of gate towers. And actually, if you go to Mount Sung today, they're covered over in sheds, and you can't see them, so I'm using old pictures. But this pagoda towers above anything that the Han built. It reappropriates sacred space as Buddhist space of the Northern Wei. And if you continue on the mountain, you will find Tang pagodas that tower yet higher, because this is sacred landscape of royalty who practice Buddhism, and it gets reappropriated. This is the last thing that I will show you, because it continues this theme that I am presenting of how no matter what kind of architecture we look at, we see the repeated patterns in the 5th, the 6th, and 7th centuries. I am back in Yungang, city of Datong, the Yungang Buddhist caves. Earliest are the 460s, the latest are the 490s, and there are some very late additions. But the core has those dates, and what you see right here are 5 pairs of cave temples. We know who dedicated them and whom they're dedicated to. They're dedicated to husband-wife royalty, who were royalty during the period of the Northern Wei. What are the plans that we have here? Either one room with a central pagoda, or 2 rooms, a Buddha hall or antechamber, and a pagoda behind it. These are the plans of tombs that we have seen, and these are the plans of monasteries. I'll show you all of them now in kind of a review or a revision. This is the plan. The entry gate, here's the pagoda, and here's the Buddha hall. Space is reversed. Why? Sometimes people think that in interior space, people are looking from the top and they see it in mirror image, but it's true. The space of pagoda first and Buddha hall behind it reverses inside a Buddhist cave. On the right, I'm looking at a reliquary. It's the reliquary under the Songyue Monastery pagoda, the pagoda with which I began, which has underground an antechamber, a corridor, and then the place where the pagoda is. So it is this plan, but this is a Buddhist cave. This is a place where precious objects were kept underneath the pagoda, this pagoda right here. Now I'm back to my Koguryo tomb on the right. We've seen this plan already in tombs. The antechamber and then the space behind the antechamber, which is where the burial takes place. The pagoda represents that. Caves, above-ground monasteries, reliquary space, tomb space. It moves around not necessarily in straight lines, but it coexists during a period of several centuries, so that relief sculpture, the facade of a cave, the interior of a Yungang cave, or a painting on a Koguryo tomb are presenting a very shared image through this period. So thank you. If I can stay, I can take a few questions, but if not, if we have to go out of the room, we will go outside and take the questions there. Let Anne decide.